listed at all. So you can add a 1-year warranty and have the seller pay for it. Buyers can ask a seller to pay for it. Agents sometimes will offer to pay for it. The question here, when we're looking at this case study, is we don't have a warranty policy in front of us, so I don't know what the warranty would cover. And warranties tend to be offered by companies like American Home Shield, the other something home warranty, or Farmers, I think, offered. Several insurance companies offer them. So they're a risk analysis. The idea is they think that there's less likelihood that there'll be a claim. They hire their own contractors. It's kind of like you having to select a doctor in a PPO program or something. And there's a deductible. Could be $35, could be $50, could be $100, depending upon what the case is. So in order to know from a business standpoint if a warranty is a viable answer, it's a good question to raise. We'd have to be looking at a policy and seeing what it actually covers. But that's something you'll want to learn about in detail once you get into practice. See what kind of warranties you have available to sell through your office and see how they work. You'll make, between you and your broker, you'll make 10 to 20% commission on them. You need to disclose that. So when you're trying to sell the seller on, hey, pay $500 for this warranty, at the same time you need to point out to them, by the way, my office is going to make $100 and I'll get half that, or whatever your deal is. Because remember, you have to disclose compensation from any source. That includes from extra services you're selling. And it's good to put that out up front so that the seller isn't suspicious later about, did you sell me that warranty because you were going to make an extra $50 or $70? It's great litigation avoidance practice, home warranties. Why sue the seller when you can just pay a $50 deductible and have the dishwasher replaced? Or in this case, maybe have a leak repaired or whatever. But you'd have to look at that carefully to make sure that things like leaks or pre-existing structural conditions that were known are actually covered. I would be suspect that they might not in this case. All right, so anybody else want to add anything to question 1 about how you should respond? All right, and then have we gone through enough why you think that's the correct course of action? I mean, everybody pretty good, whatever your answer is, and even if you're still kind of on the fence, because it seems to me that we still could go one way or another. Is there anybody who wants to take the position straight out, flat out, hey, these things, you think they're fixed? I'm going to advise them to just roll with it, get the highest price, not worry about it.
I'd say don't worry about it.
Okay. Anybody else want to go that way?
Well, it does say in the disclosure under note, these disclosure intended to reflect the current condition of the premises and do not include previous wrongs, if any, that the seller reasonably believes that were corrected.
Okay. So here, see, that's the challenge, right? So, yeah, that's really the challenge. You could read the statute and see what it is, and then you got to figure out, what am I going to do about it? All right, so let's look at question number 3, and we will wrap this up at the end. I don't want to put, make it too obvious in the middle here, but how might different responses that you could give affect the outcome of your listing appointment?
Like refuse to list with me.
Yeah, if you handle it poorly, or even if you handle it well, but they think it's poorly, right? Because this is salesmanship, if you will, at that moment in time. How well can you present them with whatever you think the facts are and have them trust you and have that endear them to you even more?
Well, now that you know that information, don't you have to disclose it? If somebody says, hey, is this basement ever flooded?
Well, doesn't the issue still come back according to what we read in the Act, that if there's a reasonable belief that something is fixed, the seller's not liable? I mean, isn't that what the Act, is there anybody here who disagrees that that's what the Act says? Let's deal with that. I mean, I'm just reading verbatim what the statute says. Right? I mean, it says that, the seller should not be liable if their inaccuracy or error or omission is based on a reasonable belief that the problem was corrected.
So then would you say no, and then when the potential buyer comes through and says, hey, what's up with the crack in the wall? Would you say, well, it was repaired?
Yeah, I mean, it's obvious. I mean, we've talked about the fact that 2 of these are visible. In fact, that there's no finished areas, and that the crack is extremely visible. The pinhole that was patched, less so. In fact, it's only about a foot from the air conditioner, as I recall, and it's in an area where you're probably not going to be walking a lot or whatever. You just look over and In fact, it's probably only a foot from a floor drain, and where the condensate drain, comes in, it might get water on the floor from any number of sources there, and maybe nobody would think twice about it. And the concrete wash on the outside, around the corrugated metal window well, is also an obvious and open thing, but not the kind of thing anybody's necessarily going to be looking for or notice, the same way you would see the epoxy injected crack. So sure, I mean, you can't lie under any circumstances. At a minimum, right, you owe fair and honest dealing. So if somebody asks what's up with the wall, oh, that was repaired and blah, blah, blah. And as we talked about a few minutes ago, it's a good thing to sell, right? There's a warranty available. You might even stick a note on one of the plastic tubes that, lifetime transferable warranty or 5-year transferable warranty or whatever. So that one's relatively straightforward. We still have the other two, though, that we're trying to figure out what to do. So it is a bit of a risk, however you comport yourself at the listing appointment, that you might not get the listing. Anything else anybody wants to add to that? Number 4, how might your response shape the outcome of their future sales transaction? So we've been talking about what you would say and why you would say it, or what you would not say, or what you would tell them not to say. How do the impact of those answers, depending upon which one you select, how might that affect the sales transaction once this thing goes to contract and then potentially closes, or presumably closes?
Well, I think the more you disclose about the problems, then the less likely the buyer will commit to the contract and buy the house.
So you're saying that if you do disclose,
Yeah.
that you're risking selling for a lower price, or you'll have fewer buyers to choose from because the odds are some buyers are going to be scared off by the disclosure.
Yeah.
Okay?
At the very least, I can see more contingencies.
More contingencies in the sales contract, contingent upon, say, having those things checked out, for example, or you're going to flood the outside of your house and see if the basement leaks. Any other?
The window is the thing that bothers me the most. If it's finished by that window and then it rains, well, it's gonna do some serious damage. Whereas the pinhole in the floor, unfinished area, well, that's not gonna hurt anything really.
But people store things in unfinished areas of their basement.
Yeah.
You might put some extra, end tables or something down there where if it floods, it's gonna destroy them. Now your real, or your personal property just got destroyed because you didn't know it flooded, because they didn't disclose that to you.
Yeah, we don't know if we're talking about puddling here or if we're talking about inches.
Yeah.
I don't even know. You can imagine a crack in a wall. Of course, I don't even know if the crack in the wall that they told me. You don't even know if wall cracks even leak. Not all do. Some cracks in walls never do get water intrusion. It's just unsightly. Looks bad. So you patch it to keep the and that epoxy helps to bond those two pieces of wall together, so you don't get further movement. Hopefully, it becomes the structural integral unit you originally expected. All right, so we have potential for lower price, potential for contingencies. Anything else? Those are if we disclose. What are the potentials if we decide that it's not necessary to disclose?
You could be sued.
You can be sued if what happens?
I guess if it leaks and there's damage.
Okay, so
Find out that there was a problem and the sellers didn't disclose it.
all right, so let's look at that. So let's say the thing goes to contract and closes, and then something leaks, right? That's what you're suggesting,
Yeah.
all right? So then you're saying the possibility there is a lawsuit. And if you end up in a lawsuit, what is the seller's defense going to be?
Well, my agent told me I didn't have to.
Well, it could be my agent told me I didn't have to. You'll want to think about that for a minute.
Or-
But, wouldn't the seller's defense, absent pointing the finger at one of us, wouldn't it be, I had a reasonable belief that it was repaired? Right, wouldn't that be a defense?
Yeah.
Then the question is that defense viable? Is that any good? And who makes that decision as to whether your belief was reasonable or not?
Judge.
Or a judge or a jury.
I think they usually go with the downtrodden side.
Yeah, so what George is bringing up there is the idea that if you have a hair-splitting, fence-straddling, difficult decision to make, courts tend to side with the party who's damaged. And whether, it was foreseeable, and what's really the risk of ending up in court where somebody's deciding if your belief was reasonable or not?
Bias.
Maybe bias, but also, and there's a phrase that comes from the fact that the NFL plays all its games, most of its games on Sundays, and the next day everybody knows how to have better coach the team. What's it called? Monday morning quarterbacking, right? It's a way to say second guessing somebody. So when you get into court and there's a legal hassle and you're trying to prove that your belief that this was repaired was reasonable, what's the other side trying to prove? That it was not, and you're now subject to this Monday morning quarterbacking, this looking in the rearview mirror, this hindsight is 20/20 kind of concept. So it's clear what the statute says. It's not so clear to me what the statute means. Does everybody follow that? There's a reason why I've had you read this statute, because I think it's plainly clear what it says, but I think it's completely unknown what that means because of the adversarial legal system we have, where you're going to have to prove that you had a reasonable belief, and I have no idea how you do that, except in which case. Correct, why? Because it was prepared by a contractor, by a professional. So even if you don't have a warranty in that case, aren't you still in a stronger position to prove your belief was reasonable? You have a contractor who's maybe licensed in that area, experienced in that area, you've got 3 references, they were recommended by somebody, whatever. You've got that scenario where you don't have that in the other 2, right? So reasonableness is very subjective.
I have a question.
Yes.
Would a seller have to share with the buyer the paperwork to confirm that the work was done versus word of mouth? Is that ever something that occurs?
If you're representing the buyer, it would be a reasonable thing as an agent to ask for that. So, the seller may say, I've got a warranty. As a listing agent, that night you should say, do you have a copy of the warranty? We should just put that out, make that available. Today, you can scan that in as a PDF and upload it to the MLS. If you're going to disclose that item, you could just have the document right there. You wouldn't have to have it like a copy of it sitting out on the dining room table. It's available for any agent that bothers to click on the links, just like the disclosure forms themselves would be, or can be. So, yeah, you would want, as a listing agent, you would want to ask them for it. As a buyer's agent, if you haven't seen it, you'd want to ask for it to be provided to you. Other questions about that so far? Number 5 just asks us to sort of come up with a well-completed list of all of the potential issues. Have we hit on them? Lawsuits, leaks, damage, losing the listing.
Compromise pricing.
What was the last one?
Compromise pricing.
Yeah, compromised pricing maybe, contract issues, contingencies.
And I also put that might have a negative effect on the friendship.
Yeah, well, that's why I made this true to scenario where, and where you know the people. When you're first getting in the business, and I've been in the business for a few years at this point, but not a lot, you are counting on your friends and family to kind of help send business your way. And when somebody you've known for 20 years calls you out of the blue and says, hey, I'd like you to sell my house, it's manna from heaven. It gets you through to the next month or the next quarter, or it's a deal that you wouldn't otherwise have had, and you didn't have to spend any time on it, and you know that if you just do a decent job, you've got a good relationship because you go in having a good relationship. So that is a challenge. That, this is family, these are friends, whatever. It can make things more difficult. I think it was said earlier, it doesn't change the way you should do business, but it changes the way you feel about how you do business. It's a more sensitive kind of thing. You're more sensitive to how people think. It can cause you some sleepless nights. I do a lot of business with friends and family. Today in real estate, that's almost all the people I do business with. And yet it's, challenging, emotionally especially. Anything else on number 5 that we need to add? All right, is there anything left we need to ask the sellers from number 6? We said we would ask them about the warranty. I guess we kind of, it's understood, we would ask them, or they've told us about how they've made the repairs. Is there anything left we need to ask them about?
Is there anything else you want to disclose to me that you haven't basically told me already?
Yeah, that's appropriate. Is there anything else you need to disclose? Any other problems you've had? That's a little broader than just this area, but that's an appropriate question. And to point out that's what the form is for. And as Ebony mentioned, it isn't just the specifics on the form, it's any material, hence relevant fact, which basically comes down to what would impact a buyer's interest in the property, what would impact what a buyer would pay for the place. Anything like that is going to be considered a relevant material fact. All right, so I think we've probably done pretty well with number 6.
I had one more then.
Oh, go ahead.
I thought I would ask them if they'd be willing to have it inspected to see if there were any other steps that they could take to make it more viable or whatever.
Well, more reasonable to believe that they have it repaired. So that goes back to
Any other
maybe
steps
what
that-
Braden mentioned also earlier, yeah, about having the thing inspected ahead of time. Now, what's one of the things that happens if you do suggest to them at the night you're trying to sign up this listing, if you suggest they have it inspected, what happens to the listing process at that point? It at least temporarily comes to a halt, right? So I'm not saying that that's a bad idea, I'm simply pointing out this is what you have to deal with when you're sitting there, because I guarantee you, you'd rather sign up that listing, as would they, since they called you, and now then you have to then deal with that. And there's always a risk that if you leave without that listing, what could happen to it?
Goes to someone else.
Could go to somebody else. That shouldn't impact how you act, but I'm bringing that up now so you'll recognize that's the kind of thing you can run across and that you have to figure out how to deal with on the fly while you're in the middle of it. Question number 7, if the sellers ask you to complete the form on their behalf so that all they have to do is sign it, should you do so? Why or why not? Forms are daunting, they're confusing, people don't really, they've never seen it before. If somebody says, just here's what happened, fill it out for me, what are you gonna say?
No.
And why would you say no?
It's probably not allowed.
It's allowed under the Act. I mean, all that the Act requires is that it's the seller's information and that the seller signs it. Right, if the seller's 16-year-old teenage daughter was there, she could fill it out for them as long as they signed it, right? That's not a problem. So if it's not allowed, it's allowed by law. How might it not be? Who might not allow you to do it? It's possible your sponsoring broker in their policy and procedures manual might forbid you to do it. And I guarantee you that any real estate continuing education instructor who's schooled in liability avoidance techniques is going to tell you, don't fill it out. Give it to them to fill out. Because as it was pointed out earlier, what's one of the things that can happen, you end up in court, and who do they point a finger at? You. I didn't fill it out, she filled it out. I didn't fill it out, he filled it out. I just signed it. Or
By signing, wouldn't they take all responsibility?
remember, we have two different types of individuals involved in litigation when you're talking about, or any kind of grievance or complaint, even at the Realtor Trade Association level. And there are arbitration procedures, grievance procedures there as well. You have a professional who's held to a professional standard, which is higher, and a consumer who's held to a reasonable person standard, which is kind of the typical one, amongst us. And as soon as you become a professional, which you do the instant you are a sponsored licensee, you're held to a much higher standard. And you are expected immediately to behave equal to the ability of the average real estate agent, who might, on average, have 10, 12, 15 years experience. So you have to be a little bit careful. As soon as you become a professional, you're held to that higher standard immediately. So in a finger-pointing case between an agent and a consumer in court, the consumer will usually win, unless the agent can prove something else is going on. And as you'll see in another case we'll look at yet tonight, sometimes that's hard for an agent to do. Anything else with number 7. Everybody pretty clear on that? So you're gonna avoid filling that out or avoid directing them as to how to fill it out, except for the very basics of, here's what you read, here's where the act is, here's the form, here's where you sign, here's where you print your name and address. I used to print the people's name and address. I have good handwriting, a lot of people today don't. I don't do that anymore because it's hard to tell that I didn't fill the form out if I filled out the name and address and all you have after that are X's and checks. Right? So I don't even put people's information on it anymore unless I would type it in and hand it to them that way. You can type stuff in on a PDF. Otherwise, I would have them do it all by hand right there at the listing appointment. What happens when sellers provide a clean disclosure form and then a problem arises later during the listing period before a contract has been signed? This is the last question before we get on with the results of what we should be doing here. So let's assume that we have a clean disclosure form, we decide not to disclose, or the sellers decide not to disclose, and then a problem arises. You're not under contract yet, or you're under contract. Well, yeah, let's just say you're not under contract yet, and all of a sudden there's a little bit of water in the basement that has to be mopped up. What do you have to do as an agent?
Well, the seller has reasonable time to fix the problem, and then you just make an amendment to the contract?
Well, assuming we don't even have a sales contract yet, it's just being listed. It's just in the MLS. People are coming through every third day, let's say. And yeah, there's a small problem, not a big deal, but now you can no longer say there hasn't been water. Let's just say it's the pinhole, for example, that little water, heavy rains, hydraulic pressure builds up underneath the house. The seam with the hydraulic cement to the old concrete isn't good, and a little water comes up. Now the seller sees it, you know it. Even though you've got a clean disclosure, what do you have to do? Unless they repair it in some other different way, you've got to disclose that. The seller has to disclose that. Your job at that point is to get the seller to provide a new disclosure that shows the defect that 2 days earlier, 2 weeks earlier, 2 months earlier, you didn't think you had to disclose. It's true in any kind of scenario. Anytime you have a clean disclosure form in part or in whole and a problem arises, it has to now be disclosed, unless you have some repair. Any other comments or questions anybody has about this before we kind of sum this up? All right, again, so just to recap, we had 3 possible water intrusion spots because they had existed in the past. A fairly long, ugly, and obvious crack in the foundation wall, which had been epoxy injected by a contractor. So we know we're going to ask, do you have a warranty? And we're going to make that known and obvious, and here's the warranty. The other 2 we're less certain on. We've got a pinhole that was patched with hydraulic cement, which is a viable method for that kind of low pressure sort of water scenario. It should work well. And then we had the owner's inventive use of just building up the concrete around the window well a little bit higher, so that the water is less likely to come in up and over the window well and into that window opening and into the finished part of the basement. So here's what I did, and then I'll tell you kind of how it played out. So I said to this couple, who, by the way, the man is pretty handy, and I never took that into account. I mean, it's a viable question, I think, to consider, but I thought it immaterial. And I'm not sure, but I still think it is. And I said to them, look, I can't tell you what to do here, because whatever I tell you is called the unauthorized practice of law. So think back to everything we talked about in the last 25 minutes. If you told them what this statute said, whose chair are you sitting in? The attorneys. Okay, you can point out to them that the statute is on the back and have them read it. You can suggest to them that they seek legal counsel, either immediately if they have a phone number of their attorney, or you put the listing on hold and they talk to them the next day and you go back, or whatever. But the easy thing to do is to say, well, I know what it says right here, you're not responsible. The problem is we can't do that, because that's interpreting a statute, and that takes a law license, and that ain't us. So we're not really able to offer them any kind of advice as to what to do in this scenario. Not only because we want to avoid liability, but because simply in Illinois especially, we cannot. Because of the Chicago Bar Association versus Quinlan and Tyson case, for 50 years now, we haven't been able to offer that kind of suggestion. So my response to them was, well, look, I can't tell you what to do, but I can tell you this is what I would do if it were me. If this were my house, I would go ahead and disclose all 3 items. If you notice on the disclosure form, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, there's a place down here where it asks you, please explain here or use additional pages as necessary if you marked yes up here. So I said, why don't you look at handwriting 1 sentence or 1 very brief paragraph for each one of these 3 issues. Why don't you go ahead and think about disclosing them all on the front and then explaining the fact, like you explained to me, what you did and that you haven't seen water in 2 or 2.5 years. So that's what they did. And then we listed the house that night. And true to my experience in the business, I have never, ever seen a disclosure of a material defect have a noticeable and obvious impact on price or selling time. Not even remotely. A house that has clear and obvious water problems has clear and obvious water problems, and that by itself is the factor that scares people away. That big ugly crack in the foundation wall is what it is, disclosed or not. People are going to see it and think of it what they think of it. What could happen and what concerned me was the fact that I didn't know, what a reasonable belief was. Now I had in the class here at Waubonsee 8-9 years ago, a woman who was an attorney. Literally, she was an attorney and came and took this class. I was flattered. She practices in the area here, very sharp gal. Her husband, a real estate developer. They came and took the class together. It was like Wednesday night date night or something for the 2 of them. It was kind of fun. I'm sure the 2 of you in the back get that idea. Well, it's either this at home or this here, so whatever. My wife and I took the coursework together too. So she described a case to me that was something that was complicated enough out of this act that I didn't know how to answer it, and I still to this day can't remember how she described it. So the statute, seemingly relatively innocuous, can actually produce litigation that even attorneys can't figure out. And I've also had paralegals in the course who have said, oh yeah, we had a client, and they absolutely believed solidly that they had fixed the problem, and they went to court and lost. The sellers, in other words. So that hindsight thing is a pretty dangerous thing. So anyway, I suggested to them that they disclose. They did, and this was in 1998 or 1999, long before we were at the crest of the boom. And they received 3 offers in one day, maybe a week into the listing, 2 weeks into the listing, completely unexpected. They selected on their own, at their own choosing, who they wanted to, which one of the 3 they wanted to select to negotiate with, and we went to contract. That was a single young man, 20s, who, when he came through the house, brought an inspector and his uncle. Uncle presumably older, wiser, somebody had owned houses, maybe done some repairs, whatever. And with the disclosed stuff being disclosed, everybody had a chance to look at it, including the inspector. No issues were raised, and we sailed through the closing, no problems. So it clearly didn't cost them any money, and didn't cost them any time. So the end of the story is, 2 weeks after the closing, 2 weeks to the day, my phone rings. It's the buyer. And he's asking me for the phone number of my sellers. Now think about, all of a sudden, the new context of confidentiality here. Confidentiality never dies. The agency agreement between me and my friends ended at closing. I'm no longer their agent because I'm not representing them in anything. Right? And confidential information is anything that's irrelevant and immaterial to the buyer. And I felt that their phone number was a bit of a stretch. So I asked, so what is this about? Well, we had some hard rains last night, and water came in through the window and dampened and got the drywall wet and got water in the carpet or whatever, and I want to call them and talk to them about this. I said, oh, well, really, I don't think I can give you their phone number. I think that would violate my fiduciary duties to them. What you need to do is probably call and talk to your agent about what your options are here, because I did that already. And I said, oh. I said, well, what did he say? He said, well, there isn't anything you can do because all the problems were disclosed and we knew about it and we had it inspected. And I said, well, that's pretty much where I'm going with this. We told you everything and you decided to buy the house after having it inspected. You bought it the way it was. And the guy was pretty insistent. And I said, well, look, you have another option, and that's to call an attorney. So why don't you go ahead and do that, or just get about fixing your house? Never heard from him again. Never had a problem, never had an issue, nothing came back on my sellers. Now, what would have happened if my reaction instead would honestly have been, oh, crap, I thought those problems were fixed? Think about the different scenario that we would have had. So you have to decide on the fly, in practice, in consultation and in conjunction with whatever your broker's training is, policy and procedures manuals are, whatever you think your fiduciary duties are. But for me, it was a relatively clear thing to do, which is to go ahead and disclose these issues, state how they were repaired, and just lay it all bare. Now, we were apparently in a pretty decent market at the time, and it had no impact. Would it have an impact today? I can't say. Not for 100% certain. But would I do the same thing again? Absolutely. Providence was very kind. That heavy rain made it all the clearer, right? Made what seemed like the right thing to do, obviously the right thing to do. Usually you don't get that clarity. You go a full year, there's no problems, and you just go, well, didn't hurt. But in this case, it was clear we made the right choice. Questions about that case study or any of the issues that sort of resulted from it?
So is it kind of when in doubt, lean more towards disclosing?
When in doubt, disclose. That's really kind of an industry mantra. Knowing the risks we've talked about, the relationship, the listing, the possibility of having, dollar issues with the sale. Every one of those issues that was raised were legitimate concerns. And I think when you're talking to the sellers, when they present them to you, present the problems to you, you can point out, here are the risks. I can give you the business risks of disclosing. The business risks are, if you disclose something that you reasonably believe was repaired, it could, in theory, scare somebody off. It could, in theory, cause somebody to write an offer with a contingency they're going to want to have that inspected. In theory, it could ask somebody to offer you to cough up $500 for a home warranty. In theory, it could cause somebody to offer you less money. And then you have to explain to them the risk of the opposite side. You could end up in court, and that's a crapshoot. You're going to be trying to prove, what's a reasonable belief. So, again, you can have somebody talk to their attorney, and they're welcome to make the decision on your own. That's why you have to stay away from filling out the form or giving them specific advice. It's too complicated, even though it should read relatively straightforward. It isn't. That's the nature of litigation. It's never as easy as you think it is. Any other questions about that at all? All right, so we got the next case study, and that is the Craig Lytle versus State of Alaska Real Estate Commission. This, as you might guess, is a case that I was not involved in, but it is a real case, and I'll show you here, in fact, I should have brought this up while we're doing this. I'll show you here in just a minute. Why don't you go ahead and take a look at that. I'll warm up the screen. I actually have the transcript of the entire Supreme Court opinion online with some other stuff, but again, why don't we start talking at about 8:30, let's take it 8:35 and see where people are at in regard to this one. Again, read it, go through, there's a few more questions. In the meantime, I might stop you and point out that I've got these documents online I want to show you. Yeah, and take a break, whatever you need.